In the Middle Ages, mirrors were not the harmless household objects we think of today. By daylight, they were tools, polished metal or fragile glass, used to check a braid, adjust a collar, or admire a brooch. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, they changed. To the medieval mind, a mirror after sunset was no longer a reflection. It was an opening. A thin place. A surface where the light of day had fled, leaving only the shimmer of what might be watching from the other side. Some believed a night mirror could steal your soul. Others whispered it would call in spirits, restless ones, curious ones, who might follow you away from the glass. And so, in those long, candlelit evenings, many covered their mirrors before nightfall, or turned them to face the wall, letting the dark pass harmlessly by. Tonight, we'll step into those flickering rooms, hear the old warnings, and trace the superstition that made people fear their own reflection. The covered glass. It was a winter evening in the year 1423 when the village of Brackenford prepared for night. The snow lay heavy against the thatched roofs, the chimneys whispered pale threads of smoke, and the last sliver of sun bled away behind the hills. In the baker's cottage, a girl named Alice set down a small, polished piece of tin, her only mirror, on the table. The edges were dented, the surface warped just enough to give her reflection a faintly rippled look, like she was always standing beside water. She used it only in the daylight, for combing her hair and making sure the soot from the baking oven hadn't left her cheeks too blackened. Her grandmother, Isabet, entered the room carrying a square of dark cloth. She moved slowly, her back bent with years, but her eyes were sharp. Without a word, she draped the cloth over the mirror until it was hidden entirely. Alice frowned. "Gran, I haven't finished with it." "You have," Isabet said, in that tone that made the words final. "No looking at yourself now. It's past sunset." Alice had grown up with this rule, but her curiosity was a stubborn thing. "What could happen? It's only me in there." Her grandmother didn't meet her eyes. She busied herself at the hearth, poking the logs so the fire caught a little brighter. "It's not you I'm worried about," she said softly. "It's what might look back." The flames popped, sending up a shower of sparks. In the pause that followed, Alice thought she could almost hear, faint and quick, the sound of something tapping against the covered glass. The village warnings. In Brackenford, warnings about mirrors after sunset were woven into conversation as naturally as talk about the weather or the next harvest. They were not shouted, nor written in any rulebook, but passed from mouth to ear, grandmother to grandchild, until they felt less like superstition and more like common sense. Alice had heard them all. The smith's wife swore that a neighbor's boy once stared too long into a mirror by candlelight, and was found the next morning with white hair, though he had been barely 15. Old Brother Cedric, the parish priest, preached that mirrors after dark tempted vanity at the very hour when the devil roamed most freely. And the midwife, Mistress Hobbs, said that the glass caught shadows, not all of them yours, and some could slip free when no one was watching. On summer days, the stories amused Alice. But winter nights in Brackenford were long, and laughter carried differently in the dark. That evening, after Isabet covered the mirror, Alice stepped outside to fetch kindling. The snow was deep enough to swallow her boots with every step, and the moon lit the world in silver. In the windows she passed, every one of them glowed with firelight, and in every home, the mirrors were either faced to the wall or hidden under cloth. Except one. She stopped before the cottage of Ralph the tanner. Through the window, she saw his wife bent over her sewing table, a small round mirror resting uncovered beside her work. Candlelight spilled over its surface, and, just for a moment, Alice thought she saw movement within it. Not the tanner's wife, nor the flicker of flame, but something pale that leaned closer, as though listening. Her breath clouded in the cold air. She blinked. The surface was still. But the tanner's wife never looked up. The tanner's wife. The next morning, Alice carried a basket of rye loaves to the tanner's house. It was her weekly delivery, part of the trade that kept their household in leather aprons and sturdy boots. Ralph was out back, judging by the smell of soaking hides, but his wife, Lynette, answered the door. Lynette's face was pale, though she smiled in the polite, distant way she always did. She took the bread and offered a few silver pennies in return. Alice hesitated before speaking. "I passed by last night. I saw your sewing table." Lynette's smile faltered, just slightly. "Ah. You left your mirror uncovered," Alice said, trying to sound casual. "After sunset." For a moment, Lynette's eyes drifted past Alice, toward the interior of her cottage. Then she pushed the door wider, motioning her in. The mirror still sat on the table, the same warped little round of polished metal Alice had seen in the window. Beside it was the same unburned candle from the night before, its wick dark and cold. "I don't cover it," Lynette said simply. "Why not?" Alice asked. Lynette moved to the table, her hand hovering just above the mirror's surface, as though testing its warmth. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "I need to hear from them." "Them?" She finally looked up, her gaze steady. "My brothers. Both gone these 4 winters. They speak clearer in the night than the day." Alice opened her mouth, then shut it again. The fire popped in the hearth, and in that brief silence she thought she heard, very faintly, an echo of voices, as though someone were speaking through cupped hands at a great distance. "Not all voices are kind," Lynette added, her tone shifting. "But the mirror doesn't lie. It shows you what's there, whether you're ready or not." Alice shivered, though the room was warm. The temptation of the glass? That night, Alice found herself unable to stop thinking about Lynette's words. The image of that small, round mirror lingered like the aftertaste of bitter herbs. Not all voices are kind. The mirror in her own room was an heirloom from her mother, bronze-backed, the handle carved with curling vines. By day, it was simply part of her dressing table, but at sunset she always draped it with a piece of undyed linen, as Isabet had taught her. Tonight she stood with the cloth in her hand, hesitating. The fire in the hearth was low, casting the room in a soft orange glow. Outside, wind pressed against the shutters with a sound like restless breathing. Slowly, she lowered the cloth back to the table. Her reflection emerged from the dim glass, faint, as if standing in a fog. She leaned closer. The surface seemed deeper than she remembered, like looking down into a well at twilight. "Foolish," she whispered to herself, though her voice was oddly hushed, as if afraid of being overheard. She waited. Nothing moved. The mirror only showed her pale face, her dark eyes, the fall of her hair over one shoulder. Yet there was something about the silence. It felt listening. She almost covered it again, when a flicker passed across the glass. Not the movement of her own head, not the firelight, but a shadow slipping sideways, far behind her reflection. She turned sharply. The room was empty. When she faced the mirror again, the surface was calm. But in the very center, just above where her brow met, the faintest imprint of a smile that wasn't hers seemed to linger before fading into nothing. Alice snatched up the cloth and covered the mirror. This time, she didn't remove it. The oldest tale. At first light, Alice went straight to Isabet's cottage. The older woman was already awake, grinding dried marigold petals into powder. The smell was sharp, almost medicinal. "You've seen something," Isabet said without looking up. Alice's hands tightened around her cloak. "I left my mirror uncovered. Last night. There was—" She hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "A shadow. And a smile." Isabet's mortar stopped moving. Slowly, she set it aside. I warned you. I thought it was just superstition, Alice admitted. It is superstition, Isabet said, but her voice carried no comfort. And superstition is often born from a seed of truth. She poured the marigold powder into a small cloth pouch, tying it shut with twine. Then she motioned for Alice to sit. Long before our mothers' mothers were born, Isabet began, there was a woman in this village named Maudre. She was a midwife and a keeper of charms, much like me. One winter, her husband went out to chop wood and never returned. The men found only his axe buried in the snow. Alice leaned forward, drawn in. Maudre kept a mirror beside her bed. Isabet continued. That night, after she learned of his death, she sat before it and asked aloud to see his face once more. And she did. But it was not the face she remembered. It was pale as tallow, eyes like black pits, smiling in a way no living man smiles. The next morning, Maudre was found sitting in the same chair, her mirror uncovered, her own eyes dark as his. Alice swallowed hard. So what happens if you keep looking? Isabet met her gaze. You start to see what's on the other side more than you see yourself. And one night you'll step forward without meaning to. Alice felt the small pouch pressed into her palm. Hang this over your mirror at night, Isabet said. And don't test it again. The glass remembers your face now. The shattered night. That evening, Brackenford was unsettled by a cry in the street. Alice, carrying a basket of bread from the oven, hurried to the door. A boy ran past, panting, his voice cracking with fear. They found old Gernulf dead, he shouted, not even slowing. Alice stepped outside, heart pounding. A cluster of neighbors gathered near the weaver's cottage at the edge of the lane. She joined them, weaving between the huddled cloaks. Inside, Gernulf's small home was cold. The fire had burned out. His bed stood untouched, but the chair beside it was pulled close to a small, silver-backed mirror propped on the table. The mirror's surface was cracked through the middle, spidering lines that caught the dim light. Someone murmured, "He was sitting there when I found him." Isabet was already in the room, her old hands hovering near the covered glass. "Did he speak to anyone yesterday?" she asked. "I," said the miller. "He said he'd dreamt of his wife. Said she wanted to see him again." Alice shivered. She looked at the mirror, its split reflection showing the faces of the villagers in jagged halves. Isabet reached for the dark cloth nearby. But as she covered it, Alice caught, just for a breath, a pale hand in the glass, pressed flat against the inside of the crack, as if it were trying to push through. That night, back in her own cottage, Alice hung the marigold pouch as instructed. But the pouch swayed on its string without any wind, and she could swear she heard a faint scratching beneath the cloth. She lay in bed, staring into the dark, realizing that every mirror in Brackenford, every polished plate, every still pool of water, might be a doorway waiting for someone to forget the rule. The voice in the glass. Alice woke to the sound of it, soft at first, like fingernails brushing over wood. She thought it was mice in the cupboard, but then came the faint, muffled syllables. Her name. Drawn out slowly, as if tasted. "Ah, Elise!" She sat up in bed, every muscle rigid. The hearth was cold, and the only light came from the last thin slice of moon through the shutters. The sound came again, this time followed by a faint, wet tapping, as though something pressed its lips against the inside of the mirror. The marigold pouch still hung there, swaying, casting its little shadow on the linen that covered the glass. But the cloth was moving, not just from the swinging pouch, but from a bulge pressing outward from beneath it. Alice's first thought was to wake Isabet. Her second was that if she opened the door to leave, she'd have to cross in front of the mirror. "Come," the voice whispered. Softer now, coaxing. It's lonely, here. She forced herself to stand, legs trembling. Her hand found the poker by the hearth. With one swift movement, she knocked the pouch from the mirror. It landed on the floor with a dull thump. The cloth sagged. The bulge was gone. But before she could breathe, the whisper came again, closer than before. Let me see your eyes. The cloth twitched, then began to slide down by itself, revealing a glimmer beneath. Alice didn't wait. She slammed the poker against the mirror. The glass rang with a sick, deep tone, as though she'd struck a bell underwater. For a heartbeat, the reflection showed her not herself, but a pale, smiling woman with eyes as dark as the night beyond the window. Then the mirror went black. The mirror ban. At dawn, Alice went straight to Isabet's door, the frost crunching under her boots. The old woman answered before she even knocked, as though she'd been waiting. You saw it, Isabet said, no question in her voice. Alice nodded, still pale from the night. It knew my name. Isabet's lips pressed into a thin line. Then it's begun. We've only got until the winter turns. After that, the dark lingers too long, and their reach grows. By midday, the two of them stood in the village square. The morning market had been set out, baskets of leeks, apples stored in straw, wool skeins dyed in autumn colors. At Isabet's command, the bell on the chapel roof rang 3 sharp times. People left their goods to gather, muttering. No mirrors, Isabet told them, her voice carrying in the cold air. From sunset to sunrise, not a single bare glass in Brackenford. Not a polished pot, not a still bucket of water. Cover them, or break them. If one calls to you, do not answer. If one shows you someone you love, look away. The murmurs swelled into protests. You'd have us smash our looking-glasses? How will the barber trim a man's beard? What harm in a pot of water? Alice stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. Gernulf is dead. I saw something in his glass. It was not his wife. That silenced them more than Isabet's warnings. By the afternoon, the clanging of hammers and the splintering of wood echoed through the streets as people boarded up windows that reflected too well, covered mirrors in kitchens, and emptied their water basins before nightfall. But as the sun dipped low, a girl came running to Alice's cottage, breathless. It's my brother, she gasped. He's talking to someone in the trough, and there's no one there. The water's face. Alice didn't stop for her cloak. The snow stung her cheeks as she ran after the girl, boots slipping on the frozen mud. The village felt sharper in the cold, every roofline edged in silver frost, every shadow stretching unnaturally long in the fading light. They found the boy, no more than 10, kneeling by the horse trough behind the blacksmith's shed. His hands gripped the rim so tightly his knuckles were white, his breath steaming in the air. Thomas, the girl whispered. It's me. Come away. But the boy didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on the water's surface, which shimmered faintly despite the gathering dark. Alice crouched beside him. The reflection in the trough was wrong. It wasn't Thomas staring back. The face was older, thinner, the skin stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were too bright, and when it smiled, the lips didn't match the boy's own. Thomas, Alice said gently, you need to step back now. It says it knows a secret about you. Thomas murmured, still locked in its gaze. It says you're not afraid of it. That you should be. The reflection's mouth kept moving, but no sound came. Instead, Alice heard the faintest echo, not in her ears, but somewhere just behind her thoughts. A low, coaxing voice, promising answers if she leaned closer. She reached for the cloth in her pocket, the one Isabet had pressed into her hand the night before. When it speaks, don't listen, Isabet had told her. When it smiles, cover it. In one swift movement, Alice threw the cloth over the water's surface. The trough sloshed violently, as though something inside had struck at the covering. Thomas gasped, stumbling backward, suddenly wide-eyed and shivering. From the blacksmith's shed came a metallic clang, as if a hammer had been dropped in haste. And then, just for an instant, Alice saw a figure at the corner of the lane, watching. Tall. Still. Its face hidden, but the air around it rippled like water. The watcher in the lane. The figure did not move. The snow fell between them in slow, deliberate flakes, each one seeming to hesitate before it touched the ground. Alice's breath clouded in the cold, but the air between her and the watcher stayed oddly clear, as though even the frost avoided that space. Thomas clung to her sleeve, his teeth chattering. "It's still here," he whispered. "Inside," Alice said, pushing him toward the girl. "Now." They hurried into the blacksmith's shed. The heat from the forge should have been comforting, but it seemed to cling only to the walls, leaving the center of the room chilled. The blacksmith himself stood by the anvil, eyes darting toward the door. "You saw it?" he asked. "I saw something," Alice replied. "That's more than most get before it's gone," he muttered. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he picked up the hammer again. "Don't stand in front of the door too long. It notices." Alice looked through a gap in the boards. The lane was empty now. But the snow there, it was undisturbed, as though nothing had passed, even though she'd seen it standing in that very spot. The blacksmith leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think it needs glass or water to find you?" "No. That's only how it learns your face. Once it knows you, it can use anything that holds your likeness. A polished plate. A drop of oil. Even the shadow you cast on a bright day." Thomas swallowed hard. "Then how do we hide?" "You don't," the blacksmith said grimly. "You just pray it forgets you before the sun goes down again." From outside, faintly, came the sound of a mirror breaking. Not a sharp shatter, more a slow, deliberate crack, as if someone had bent the glass until it split. And then another. And another. The shards in the snow. By the time Alice stepped outside again, the lane was scattered with fragments. Not just one mirror, but many, small hand mirrors, bits of polished tin, even shards of glass no bigger than a thumbnail. They lay in the snow like pieces of frozen water, catching what little moonlight there was. Thomas stayed in the doorway, clutching the frame as if it might keep him tethered. "Where did all these come from?" he asked. Alice crouched and picked up a piece. It was cold, not from the snow, but from something deeper, a cold that didn't belong to the winter night. In its surface she could still see a warped reflection of her own eye, staring back. Only, the blink didn't match hers. She dropped it instantly. From the far end of the lane, someone moved, hooded, walking slowly, as if searching for something. A woman, judging by her height and the way she held her skirts above the snow. In one hand she carried a sack that clinked faintly with each step. The blacksmith came up behind Alice and hissed through his teeth. "Don't let her see you." "Who is she?" Alice asked. He shook his head. "Not who." "What?" The woman reached the nearest pile of mirror shards and began gathering them, humming softly under her breath. It was an old lullaby, one Alice knew from childhood, but here it sounded wrong, the notes dipping lower than they should, stretching longer, as if time itself bent to fit the tune. As she worked, she never once looked up. But Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she knew exactly who was watching. When the sack was nearly full, the woman straightened. The humming stopped. The lane went silent, and in that silence, Alice realized there were no other sounds, no wind, no distant barking dog, not even the faint creak of houses settling in the cold. The woman turned her head, and though her hood still shadowed her face, Alice felt the unmistakable sensation of being mirrored. The collector's bargain. The woman began walking toward them, each step sinking soundlessly into the snow. Her sack of shards swayed and clinked softly, like a bag of silver coins, only the sound was duller, heavier, as though each piece carried more weight than its size suggested. Thomas retreated into the doorway, his knuckles white against the wood. "Don't speak to her," he murmured. "Don't answer if she talks to you." Alice didn't move. Something in the woman's presence pinned her feet to the ground, not fear exactly, but a strange pull, as if her own reflection was leaning toward the woman from inside every mirror in the sack. When the woman was only a few paces away, she stopped. Her voice, when it came, was soft but impossibly clear, carrying through the air like water poured into glass. "You've seen it," she said. Alice swallowed. "Seen what?" The woman tilted her head, and a sliver of pale skin caught the moonlight beneath the hood. "The night face. It comes to some before the first frost, to others after. But once you've seen it, you cannot leave the mirror uncovered. Unless—" she shook the sack slightly, the pieces clinking. "You give it to me." Alice frowned. "What would you do with it?" The woman's mouth curved faintly, though it didn't feel like a smile. "I keep them. I lock them where no night can reach them. It is a mercy I offer." Thomas's voice was a harsh whisper. "Don't bargain. She'll take more than you give." The woman stepped closer, close enough that Alice could smell the faint metallic tang of cold metal and glass. "Leave the mirror under your bed, and sooner or later you'll hear the knock. 3 times. And when you look, you will not see yourself alone." A gust of wind finally stirred the lane, but it carried no snow, only the scent of damp stone and something old, older than the village, older than the path they stood on. Alice glanced toward her home, where her grandmother's mirror still sat hidden. She knew, without knowing how, that the woman's words were true. The choice. Alice's fingers curled against her skirts. Somewhere behind her ribs, her heart seemed to beat twice, once for herself, and once for the thing she'd seen in the mirror. The woman's hand emerged from her cloak, pale and narrow, palm up. The skin was lined, but not with age, more like the fine cracks in frost glass before it shatters. "Give it to me," the woman said again, "and you will sleep through winter without dreams." The offer sounded tempting, so tempting that for a moment, Alice imagined herself resting through every long night without the unease that had haunted her since the first glimpse of that shadow face. But then she thought of her grandmother. The mirror had been passed down for generations. It was the only thing her grandmother had ever called her protection. And her grandmother had kept it uncovered at night, never turning its face to the wall. Why? Alice licked her lips. And what if it's not meant to be taken away? What if it's meant to be kept? The woman's eyes, black, utterly black, even in the moonlight, narrowed. Then you will learn what waits in the dark when it knows your name. Behind Alice, Thomas tugged at her sleeve, his voice tense. We're not meant to talk with her. Come inside. But Alice didn't move. She could almost feel the mirror under the bed, thrumming faintly, as if aware of this conversation. Finally, she drew herself up, keeping her voice steady. It's not mine to give. The woman stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. Then, with a slow tilt of her head, she murmured, So be it. She turned, walking down the lane without another sound, her sack of shards swaying like a pendulum, until the mist swallowed her completely. Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding. You've just invited something into your life you can't send away, he said. Alice looked toward her darkened window. Maybe, she whispered. Or maybe it was already here. The knocking. That night, the wind carried a brittle cold through the village. The kind that makes shutters rattle and the chimney whistle like a hollow reed. Alice lay in bed with the quilt pulled high, her eyes fixed on the dark shape under the bed where the mirror lay. She tried to imagine it was only a harmless object, a polished surface that caught the light and gave it back. But every so often, in the corner of her mind, she saw again that shadow face staring up at her. Sometime after midnight she woke to a sound. Knock, knock, knock. Not from the door. Not from the window. It came from beneath her. Her breath caught, shallow and sharp. She pressed a hand to her mouth and listened. The knocks were slow, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart that each one seemed to wait for her pulse to calm before starting again. She dared to lean over the edge of the bed, letting her eyes adjust to the dark. There was only shadow beneath, thick and unbroken. Then, faintly, she heard it, like a voice pressed against wood. Alice! She scrambled back against the wall, heart battering against her ribs. The quilt tangled around her legs as if trying to hold her down. Alice! It was not her grandmother's voice. It was not a voice she'd ever heard before, deep, quiet, and patient, as though the speaker had all the time in the world. The mirror, she realized, wasn't just showing her things. It was calling to her. Her fingers twitched toward the floor, as if some part of her wanted to touch it, to answer. But another part, the part that remembered the woman with the sack of shards, kept her frozen. Outside, the wind fell silent. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. Knock, knock, knock. The night look. The knocks stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving a silence that felt heavier than sound. Alice sat there for what might have been minutes, might have been hours, staring into the dark gap beneath her bed. The more she tried not to think about it, the more her mind whispered, "You'll never sleep again unless you look." She swung her legs over the side, bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. Each creak of the wood felt like it might shatter the silence, and with it, her nerve. Kneeling, she pulled the quilt aside and reached for the bundle. The cloth was warm. That alone sent a tremor through her hands. It had no reason to be warm. Her breath came slow, deliberate, as she loosened the knot and let the cloth fall away. The mirror's surface was black as tar, yet it still seemed to shine, as though the darkness itself was a polished thing. And in it, her reflection. Only, her reflection was smiling. Alice wasn't smiling. Her lips were pressed tight. But in the mirror, the other Alice tilted her head, eyes glinting like wet stones, mouth curled in a slow, knowing grin. "Who are you?" Alice whispered. The reflection's lips moved, but no sound came. She leaned closer, straining to hear, until the glass fogged, as if someone inside had breathed against it. And then the smile vanished. The reflection's eyes flicked past her shoulder, as if something stood behind her. Alice froze. She did not turn. A breath, cold and damp, touched her neck. She jerked back from the mirror, fumbling the cloth over it, tying it with shaking hands. She shoved it under the bed again, the knock of wood on floor loud in the still room. But when she sat back against the wall, pulling the quilt to her chin, she could still feel the smile. Somewhere in the dark, it was still waiting for her. The priest's warning. At first light, Alice was already on the road. She hadn't slept, not truly, only dozed in bursts, waking each time the house settled or a draft moved the door latch. The bundle under her bed was still there, wrapped tight, but she avoided looking in its direction as she dressed. The village priest, Father Berenger, was in the churchyard, scattering grain for the hens that wandered freely among the graves. He was a stooped, narrow man, with a face weathered by both sunlight and sorrow. "Alice," he said, squinting as she approached, "you've the look of someone chaste." "It's about the mirror," she said, her voice thin. That word, mirror, seemed to stiffen his spine. He brushed the grain dust from his hands and motioned her into the small chapel. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and damp stone. She told him everything. The knocks. The warmth. The smiling reflection. How it looked past her shoulder. She didn't mention the breath on her neck until the end. Father Berenger listened without interrupting, though his mouth set into a grim line. When she finished, he clasped his hands before him. "You should not have uncovered it after nightfall," he said. "The old warnings are not children's stories. A mirror is a boundary. By daylight, the boundary holds. But in darkness, the world on the other side draws closer." "What's on the other side?" she asked. He hesitated. "Not the living. And not always the dead. Something in between. They see you more clearly after sunset. And if they look at you long enough." He didn't finish the thought. Alice swallowed hard. "Can I get rid of it?" "Yes," he said slowly. "But it must be done before the next full moon. Once they've found you, they will wait for the night when light is weakest. And if I wait too long?" His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw fear there. "Then it will no longer be you looking into the mirror. It will be the mirror looking out." The circle of salt. Father Berenger did not waste time. By mid-afternoon, he had gathered what he called the bindings, a small pouch of consecrated salt, a bundle of dried rowan twigs, a square of black cloth, and a brass handbell. "Tonight," he said, "we'll seal it." The plan was simple in words, but not in courage. She must bring the mirror into the center of her cottage, place it flat upon the floor, and encircle it with salt while speaking the old binding prayer. The priest would keep the bell ringing. Its sound, he claimed, drove away anything trying to cross the threshold between the glass and the living world. "It will not like being trapped," he warned as they stood by her doorway in the fading light. "Do not stop until the last grain is laid, no matter what you hear or see." When the sun finally dropped, the air seemed to grow heavier in her chest. Inside, she cleared the center of the floor, her hands trembling as she unwrapped the mirror. The silvered surface looked dull in the candlelight, but she knew better than to trust its stillness. She began to pour the salt, moving clockwise, her voice reciting the unfamiliar words Father Berenger had taught her. The first few moments were uneventful, then came the sound. It was faint at first, like distant tapping from inside a wall. Then it grew louder. Knuckles against glass. The priest's bell rang steady, but her hands faltered. A shadow, her own, she thought, shifted in the glass, though she hadn't moved. She forced herself to keep pouring, grain by grain, her breath coming fast. When the circle was nearly complete, the mirror's surface rippled. And then the smile returned, wider this time, stretching too far across the face she recognized as her own. "Do not look at it!" Father Berenger barked, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard. But it was too late. Her reflection had begun to mouth her name. The pull. The sound was not a voice, not exactly. It was the whisper of dry leaves in a winter gust, the faint hiss of something too close to the candle flame. Yet she knew, without a doubt, that it was speaking her name. Her name, over and over. The candlelight quivered, as if the air around the mirror had grown heavier, thicker. The rippling glass seemed to reach outward, the silver stretching like molten metal. Her reflection's hands pressed against the inside of the surface, the fingers long and pale, each knuckle bending too far. She felt a tug in her chest. Not physical, but rooted deeper, as if an invisible thread had caught hold of her heart. Father Berenger's bell clanged faster now, his voice raised in a chant that was both prayer and command. "By the holy light, stay bound, stay bound!" The circle of salt was almost closed. Only a small gap remained. But as she bent to pour the last handful, the reflection's eyes locked with hers, and she felt the pull sharpen, yanking her forward. Her knees buckled. The mirror's surface was inches away. In it, her doppelganger's mouth twisted, not in a smile, but in a shape that looked like hunger. The gap in the salt seemed suddenly immense. If she fell forward, if her hands broke the line, the thing in the glass could step through. The priest's hand gripped her shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Finish it, now!" he barked. Her fingers trembled, spilling half the salt onto the floorboards. The rest she flung desperately into the gap. The instant the circle closed, the mirror let out a sound that wasn't sound at all but a vibration in the bones, a sickening pressure behind her eyes. The face inside the glass twisted in fury before flattening into stillness. The pull stopped. But the mirror didn't just fade back into lifeless reflection. It was still watching. The choice. No one spoke for several heartbeats. The candle's flame steadied again, but the air was still too cold, too tight, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Father Berenger's grip loosened on her shoulder, though his eyes never left the mirror. "It's bound," he said at last. "For now." "For now?" she whispered. Her voice sounded small, like it belonged to someone else. The priest's jaw tightened. "Things like that, they wait. They listen. If the salt is broken, or the binding fades, it will try again. Destroying it would be best." She looked at the mirror. Her own face stared back, pale and exhausted, but she could still see it, just beneath the surface. Something darker, patient, and unblinking. "Destroy it," Tomas said sharply from the doorway. He'd returned during the chaos, face ashen but resolute. "We'll shatter it and scatter the pieces. Let it rot in the river." Berenger didn't move. "Breaking it might free what's inside," he said. "Shards can hold just as much as the whole. And the river doesn't wash away curses, it carries them." A silence settled, heavy and choking. "Then bury it," she said finally. "Deep enough that no one will ever dig it up. Seal it in stone." The priest's brow furrowed. "That will work, if no one disturbs it. But it will call, even muffled. That's the danger. Curiosity." Her stomach nodded. "Then we tell no one. Not about tonight, not about the mirror, not about what it can do." Tomas glanced between them. "And if someone finds it?" She met his eyes. "Then they'll learn the same way I did, by looking too long." Berenger wrapped the mirror in heavy linen, each fold dusted with salt, each knot tied tight. He handled it as though it might bite. And perhaps it would. When the cloth covered it entirely, the room felt lighter. Not safe, but less hunted. They didn't destroy it. They didn't dare. But they made plans to hide it where the earth was thick, the stones unmoving, and the dark would have no visitors. Buried glass. 3 nights later, under a moon veiled by drifting clouds, they carried the mirror to the old quarry. The village had long abandoned it, its stone too brittle for building, its depths filled with silence and stale air. Tomas held the lantern. Berenger carried the mirror, wrapped tight in its salted shroud. She followed behind, her hands full of lime and clay to seal the grave. The quarry's floor was uneven, a jagged hollow in the earth where even weeds grew thin. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the pit were whispering the sound back in a different voice. They found a crevice between 2 leaning slabs of rock. Berenger knelt and began to dig, the iron spade striking stone and frozen soil. With every thrust, the night seemed to grow heavier. At last, a hollow deep enough to swallow the thing stood ready. The priest lowered the mirror inside without ceremony, though she noticed how his hands trembled, not from the cold. They poured the lime over it first, a pale shroud that burned the throat with its dust. Then came the clay, sealing every gap, pressing the darkness down into a tomb without air. When it was done, Berenger murmured a prayer. Tomas, though never one for church, removed his cap and bowed his head. She stood silent, staring at the patch of earth until the damp seeped through her boots. "Leave it," Berenger said at last. "And don't come back." They climbed out of the quarry without looking behind. The wind at the rim felt different, less cold, but sharp, like a warning you only half understood. For years after, she kept no mirrors in her house. If she needed to see her reflection, she used a bowl of water cloudy with herbs. And if someone brought a looking glass near her after sunset, she turned it to the wall without a word. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she would think of the quarry and wonder if the cloth had rotted, if the lime had cracked, if the thing inside still pressed its face to the glass and waited.